My 16-year-old daughter saved $4,000 for a dream trip to France. Then the money disappeared. My mother said it was family helping family. I said nothing until the family dinner. The moment I realized my daughter's savings were gone, I felt something inside my chest sink in a way that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. Not anger. Not yet. Just this quiet, heavy dread that told me something was very wrong. My name is Daniel Harper. I am 42 years old, a single father to a 16-year-old girl named Sophie. If you ask anyone who knows her, they will tell you the same thing right away. Sophie is the kind of kid who dreams big but works quietly for it. France had been her dream for 3 years. Not a vague idea like most teenagers have when they say they want to travel someday. No, Sophie treated that trip like it was a long-term mission. It started when she was 13 and discovered a documentary about Paris while we were eating takeout on the couch. She became fascinated with everything about the place. The art museums, the narrow streets, the bakeries that looked like something out of a painting. For weeks afterward, she walked around the house practicing French phrases she learned from some free language app on her phone. I remember hearing her in the kitchen saying the words slowly and carefully while buttering toast before school. At the time, I assumed it was a passing phase. It was not. Within a month, she had taped a map of France to the wall above her desk. Little sticky notes marked places she wanted to see. Paris was circled 3 times in red marker. Then came the jar. Just a simple glass jar she pulled out of the pantry one afternoon. She wrote the words France Trip Fund across the front in thick black marker. That jar became sacred in our house. Every spare dollar she earned went into it. She started small, walking Mrs. Collins' dog down the street, babysitting for a neighbor on Saturday afternoons, helping a retired couple 2 blocks away rake leaves in the fall. It was not glamorous work. Most of it paid in crumpled bills and loose change. But every time she came home, she would empty her pockets onto the kitchen table and count it carefully before sliding the money into that jar. I remember one night about a year ago when we were sitting at the table eating spaghetti. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of her friends asking if she wanted to go to the mall. She looked at the message, thought for a moment, and then set the phone face down. When I asked why she was not going, she simply said she would rather save the money. That was Sophie. While other teenagers spent their cash on clothes or snacks after school, she folded every bill neatly and tucked it away. Eventually, the jar became too small. She moved the savings into an envelope, then into a small lockbox she bought herself from a hardware store. 3 years of patience. 3 years of planning. 3 years of imagining herself standing somewhere along the Seine River, probably with a pastry in one hand and her phone in the other, taking pictures of everything. I never told her this, but I was planning to help her with the rest of the cost once she got close. She thought she was doing it all herself. I liked letting her believe that. It made the dream feel bigger. That afternoon started like any other. I had just gotten home from work when Sophie walked into the kitchen holding that little metal lockbox. Something about her face made my stomach tighten immediately. She was trying very hard to look calm. But when she set the box on the table and opened it, I saw that it was completely empty. Not a single bill. Not even a coin. She kept staring down into the box like the money might magically appear again if she looked long enough. Then she said something that barely came out above a whisper. She told me she thought she had made a mistake, that maybe she had counted wrong the last time. But the way her voice trembled told me she already knew the truth. I asked her how much had been inside. She hesitated before answering. Just over $4,000. 3 years of work. Gone. At first I thought maybe someone had broken in. But the house showed no signs of that. Nothing else was missing. Then a quiet, unsettling thought crept into my mind. Only a few people even knew about that money. Family. I asked Sophie one simple question. Had anyone been in her room recently? She thought about it for a long moment before nodding slowly. My mother had visited 2 days earlier. At the time, Sophie had been at school. Mom had come by while I was at work. She said she wanted to drop off some old photo albums she found while cleaning her attic. That visit had seemed completely normal at the time. But as I stood there looking at the empty lockbox on the table, a cold feeling started to spread through my chest. Because suddenly something about that visit did not feel normal at all. And deep down, I already had a terrible suspicion about what had really happened. I just was not ready yet for the answer I was about to hear. That evening, the house felt strangely quiet. Sophie had carried the empty lockbox back to her room, saying she wanted to double-check everything. I could hear her moving around upstairs, opening drawers and shifting things on her desk, like maybe the money had somehow ended up somewhere else. But we both knew it had not. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the metal box she had left behind earlier. The lid was scratched from years of being opened and closed, and there was a tiny sticker on the corner shaped like the Eiffel Tower. She had put that there herself. 3 years of saving, $1 at a time. I kept replaying the timeline in my head, trying to make sense of it. 2 days earlier, my mother had stopped by the house while Sophie and I were both out. She had called me that afternoon to say she was dropping off a few boxes of old family photos. I had thanked her and told her she could leave them by the front door. At the time, it had felt like nothing. Now it felt like everything. I stood up from the table and walked over to the hallway closet where the photo boxes were stacked. They were exactly where she said she left them. Dusty albums from the 1980s and 90s, filled with pictures of birthdays, holidays, and old vacations. Completely ordinary. Too ordinary. I felt ridiculous for even thinking what I was thinking. My mother had always been stubborn, sometimes overly involved in family matters, but she was not the kind of person who would steal from her own granddaughter. At least that is what I kept telling myself. Still, the thought refused to leave. About an hour later, Sophie came back downstairs. She had that careful expression on her face again, the one people use when they are trying very hard not to cry. She sat across from me at the table and folded her hands together. She said she checked everywhere. Her desk drawers, her closet, even her backpack from school. Nothing. I asked her again if anyone had been upstairs that day my mother visited. She hesitated before answering. Apparently, my mother had gone up to her room for a moment. She told Sophie later that she was just curious about how big Sophie had gotten and wanted to see her room again. At the time, Sophie thought it was sweet. Now she was not so sure. That detail settled into my chest like a stone. My mother had been in that room. Alone. Near the lockbox. Sophie quickly added that she was probably overthinking it. She kept saying maybe she had moved the money somewhere else and forgotten. But I could see the truth in her eyes. She was trying to protect someone. Trying not to believe something that felt impossible. I nodded slowly and told her we would figure it out. But inside my head, the same thought kept repeating itself. If the money did not disappear by accident, then someone had taken it. And I was starting to realize there was only one person who even had the opportunity. Still, accusing your own mother of something like that is not a small step. So instead of confronting her right away, I picked up my phone and decided to do something simpler first. I called my sister Emily. Because if something strange had happened in our family recently, she would know. What she told me next made my stomach drop even further. Emily answered on the third ring. My sister has always been the kind of person who talks fast and jumps between topics like her brain runs 2 steps ahead of her mouth. But the moment she heard my voice, she immediately asked if something was wrong. Apparently, I sounded tense. I tried to keep my tone normal. I told her I just had a quick question about Mom. I asked if she had seen her recently, or if anything unusual had come up in the past few days. There was a short pause on the line. Then Emily said something that made my stomach tighten. She told me Mom had been busy helping with wedding preparations. That part alone did not surprise me. Emily's wedding was coming up in a couple of months, and Mom had been treating the whole thing like a full-time job. Decorations, catering discussions, dress fittings, seating charts. The entire family had heard about it nonstop for weeks. But Emily continued. She mentioned that things had gotten a little stressful recently because some unexpected costs popped up. Apparently, the venue required a larger deposit than they originally planned. Emily sounded slightly embarrassed when she explained it. She said weddings were expensive and things were getting tighter than expected. Then she said something that made the room feel colder. She told me Mom had promised to help cover the difference. I leaned back in my chair slowly. Mom had always liked to play the hero in family situations. If someone needed help, she stepped in. Sometimes even when nobody asked. Still, something about the timing did not sit right with me. I asked Emily when Mom offered to help. She thought for a moment before answering. 2 days ago, the same day Mom visited my house. For a few seconds, I just sat there listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Emily kept talking, explaining how grateful she was and how Mom had told her not to worry about it. According to her, Mom said she had managed to find the money. Those exact words. Find the money. A slow pressure began building behind my temples. I asked Emily one more question. Did Mom say where the money came from? Emily laughed softly and said something that felt strangely dismissive. Mom had simply told her that sometimes family had to help each other. That phrase stuck in my head. Family helps family. After the call ended, I sat there staring at my phone. Upstairs, I could hear Sophie walking around her room again. The floor creaked lightly under her steps. I imagined her standing in front of that empty lockbox again, trying to understand how 3 years of work could vanish in a single afternoon. The pieces were starting to fit together. Mom visits the house. Mom goes upstairs. Mom suddenly has extra money to help with Emily's wedding. I did not want to believe it, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Still, there was only one way to know for sure. I picked up my car keys from the counter and headed for the door. Sophie called from the top of the stairs, asking where I was going. I told her I just needed to talk to Grandma for a few minutes. What I did not say out loud was the truth that had begun forming in my chest. If my suspicion was correct, then someone in our family had decided that my daughter's dream was less important than a wedding. And I was about to hear that justification face to face. My mother lives about 20 minutes away in the same small neighborhood where my sister and I grew up. The drive there felt longer than usual. I kept replaying everything in my head. Emily's words. The timing. That phrase Mom used about finding the money. Every mile made the knot in my chest tighter. By the time I pulled into her driveway, the porch light was already on. Her house looked exactly the same as it always had. The same white siding, the same flower pots near the steps, the same wind chime that clinked softly in the evening breeze. Completely normal. That almost made it worse. I knocked once before letting myself in. Mom had always been the type who told family not to bother with formalities. She was sitting at the dining table when I walked in, surrounded by papers, fabric samples, invitation cards, and a laptop open to what looked like a wedding planning website. Emily's wedding had clearly taken over her entire life. She looked up and smiled the moment she saw me. For a brief second, I almost questioned myself. She looked so relaxed, so pleased with whatever she had been working on. Then she asked what brought me by. I pulled out a chair across from her and sat down slowly. For a moment, I just watched her shuffle through the papers like nothing in the world was wrong. Finally, I asked a simple question. I asked if she had stopped by my house 2 days earlier. She nodded right away, completely casual about it. She reminded me about the photo albums she left by the door and said she hoped Sophie liked looking through them. Then I asked something a little more specific. I asked if she had gone upstairs while she was there. Again, she nodded. She said she had stepped into Sophie's room for a moment. She described it almost fondly, saying it was strange seeing how grown up everything looked. Then she laughed lightly and said my daughter had excellent taste in decorations. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the afternoon. I asked if she had seen the metal lockbox on Sophie's desk. That was the first moment her expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight pause. Her hand stopped moving through the papers. Then she leaned back in her chair and sighed like someone who had been expecting this conversation eventually. She said she knew I would ask about that. There was no shock in her voice. No confusion, just calm certainty. Then she explained it. Not like someone confessing to a mistake. More like someone explaining a perfectly reasonable decision. She said Emily had needed help with the wedding deposit. The venue was threatening to cancel their reservation if the payment did not come through in time. Family was under pressure. Things were stressful. And sometimes people had to make sacrifices for each other. Then she looked directly at me and said the words that made my stomach drop. She told me she had borrowed the money. According to her, it was temporary. Emily's wedding would be paid off eventually. The trip to France could simply happen later. In her mind, it was not theft. It was family helping family. She even smiled slightly, as if expecting me to understand. But as I sat there staring at her across the table, something cold settled into my chest. Because she had not asked. Not me. And definitely not Sophie. And the way she talked about it made it sound like my daughter's dream was nothing more than a small inconvenience. What she said next made it even worse. For a few seconds, I just sat there staring at her. I kept waiting for the part where she would admit it had been a mistake. Maybe she would say she panicked. Maybe she would say she meant to call me but forgot. That moment never came. Instead, Mom folded her hands on the table and spoke in the same calm tone she used when explaining something simple to a child. She said I needed to look at the bigger picture. According to her, Emily's wedding was something important for the whole family. People had already made travel plans. Deposits had been paid. If the venue canceled their reservation, it would create chaos for everyone involved. Then she said something that made my jaw tighten. She said Sophie was young. Trips could wait. She talked about it like my daughter had simply lost a weekend at the mall, not 3 years of careful saving. I reminded her that the money belonged to Sophie. Mom waved that away almost immediately. She said Sophie lived under my roof, and technically everything in that house existed because of family support over the years. According to her, it was not unreasonable for family resources to shift when someone needed help. Family resources. That was how she described it. I asked her directly why she did not just ask. Her answer came quickly, because she knew I would say no. There was no shame in the way she said it. Just simple logic. She said sometimes parents had to make decisions that younger generations might not understand yet. In her mind, this was one of those situations. Emily's wedding was happening now. France could happen later. Then she leaned forward slightly and added one more thing. She said Sophie did not even need to know the full story. That part made my stomach turn. Mom suggested we could quietly put the money back over time. Maybe give Sophie birthday money, holiday money, things like that. Eventually the amount would rebuild itself and everything would balance out. Like nothing had happened. Like 3 years of work could simply be erased and replaced with polite little envelopes over time. I asked her if Emily knew where the money came from. Mom hesitated for the first time. Then she said it did not matter. Emily was stressed enough with wedding planning already. There was no need to involve her in unnecessary drama. Unnecessary drama. Upstairs in my house, my daughter was probably still staring at an empty lockbox wondering what she did wrong. And here my mother was calmly suggesting we treat the whole situation like a minor bookkeeping adjustment. That was the moment something shifted inside me. I stood up from the table slowly. Mom frowned slightly and asked where I was going. I told her I needed some time to think. She seemed satisfied with that answer, almost relieved. As I walked toward the door, she called after me and said something that stayed with me the entire drive home. She reminded me not to overreact. After all, it was only money. But when I got back to the house and saw Sophie sitting quietly on the couch pretending to watch television, I realized something very clearly. This was never just about money. And that realization was the beginning of a plan I had not told anyone about yet. When I got home, Sophie was sitting on the couch with the television on. But she was not really watching it. Anyone who has raised a kid knows that look. The screen was playing some random show, but her eyes were fixed somewhere past it, like her mind was still turning over the same question again and again. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and took a moment before walking into the living room. She glanced up when she heard me. For a second, I could see the hope in her expression, the kind that appears when someone thinks maybe you solved the problem while you were gone. I sat down in the chair across from her. She asked quietly if Grandma knew anything. I told her the truth, but only part of it. I said Grandma had borrowed the money to help with Emily's wedding deposit. I explained that there had been some kind of issue with the venue and that she panicked trying to fix it. Sophie listened carefully without interrupting. Then she nodded slowly. She did not cry. She did not yell. She just leaned back into the couch and stared at the television again. After a moment, she said something that hurt more than anger ever could. She said she guessed weddings were important. Then she added that maybe she should have hidden the money better. I told her that none of this was her fault, but the words sounded weak even to my own ears. Sophie shrugged slightly and said she understood how family worked sometimes. People helped each other when things got difficult. She was repeating the same idea my mother had used earlier. Family helps family. But the way Sophie said it felt completely different. Not proud, just resigned. After a few minutes, she stood up and said she was tired. She wished me good night and walked upstairs. The house became quiet again. I stayed on the couch for a long time after that, staring at the dark television screen. My mother thought the situation was simple. Money had been borrowed. Eventually, it would be returned. Problem solved. But she had missed something important. This was not just about $4,000. It was about what that money represented. 3 years of discipline. 3 years of saying no to things most teenagers say yes to. 3 years of believing that if she worked hard enough, she could reach a dream that mattered to her. And someone had decided that dream could be taken without even asking. Around midnight, I finally stood up and walked into the kitchen. I opened my laptop and started looking through my savings account. Numbers, transfers, balances. I was not rich, but I had done well enough over the years to build something stable. As I studied the screen, a quiet idea began forming in my mind. Not revenge. Not an argument, just a correction. If someone in this family believed Sophie's dream could be pushed aside so easily, Then I was going to make sure they understood exactly how serious I was about putting it back where it belonged. But the plan I started putting together that night was not something I planned to explain right away. In fact, for the next few weeks, I let everyone believe I had accepted the situation. And that quiet silence made what happened next even more shocking for the entire family. The strange thing about family pressure is that it rarely sounds like pressure at first. It comes wrapped in smiles and gentle reminders. Over the next 2 weeks, that was exactly what I experienced. My mother called a few times to talk about Emily's wedding plans. She spoke like nothing serious had happened. She mentioned flower arrangements, seating charts, and how beautiful the venue looked in the latest photos. Not once did she bring up Sophie's money again. Emily also called once or twice. She sounded excited and overwhelmed the way most brides do. She talked about dresses and invitations and how relieved she felt now that the deposit issue had been solved. Again, no mention of where that money came from. The whole family had quietly accepted the story my mother created. A temporary solution. A small sacrifice. Nothing worth arguing about. And according to them, the best thing I could do was move forward. My Aunt Carol even sent me a message one evening saying she heard there had been a little tension about the wedding costs. She told me not to make it a big deal. Weddings were stressful enough already. She finished the message with the same sentence everyone seemed to use lately. Families should support each other. I read that message twice before putting my phone down. Because the more I heard that phrase, the more something about it started to feel backwards. During those same weeks, Sophie stayed quiet about the whole situation. She went to school, did her homework, and helped around the house like usual. But one small thing changed. The map of France disappeared from the wall above her desk. I noticed it one night when I walked past her open bedroom door. The sticky notes were gone. The red circle around Paris was gone. She had taken the whole thing down. When I asked about it later, she shrugged and said she probably needed the space for school papers. The way she said it told me everything. She had already started letting go of the dream. That was exactly what my mother expected. Time would pass. The excitement would fade. Eventually, Sophie would forget about the trip. But the plan I had started working on that night after visiting my mother was already moving forward. Quietly, step by step, I had made a few phone calls, sent a few emails, moved some money between accounts. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else would notice yet. By the end of the 3rd week, everything was ready. And the perfect moment to reveal it came sooner than I expected. Because my mother decided to host a small family dinner to celebrate the final wedding preparations. Everyone was invited. Emily, her fiancé, my Aunt Carol, a couple of cousins, and of course, Sophie and me. When we arrived that evening, the house was full of laughter and conversation. Emily looked radiant with excitement, and my mother seemed proud of how smoothly everything had come together. To them, the crisis had passed. The wedding was safe. The family was happy again. They thought the problem had disappeared. But as I watched Sophie quietly take a seat at the table, I realized something important. The problem had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the right moment. And before the night was over, everyone in that room was going to understand exactly what that moment looked like. Dinner at my mother's house always followed the same rhythm. People arrived carrying dishes. Someone opened a bottle of wine. My mother moved around the kitchen like a conductor directing a small orchestra of family members. That night felt no different on the surface. Emily was glowing with excitement, sitting beside her fiancé, Mark, while everyone asked questions about the wedding day schedule. My Aunt Carol was already talking about what dress she planned to wear. Even my cousins were joking about the reception and who might embarrass themselves on the dance floor. Normal family noise. Sophie sat beside me at the table, quiet but polite. She smiled when people spoke to her, but I could tell she was mostly trying to disappear into the background. At one point, my mother stood up and tapped her glass lightly with a fork. She said she wanted to say a few words before dinner. Everyone turned toward her. She started talking about how proud she was of Emily, how weddings brought families together, how important it was for everyone to support each other during big life moments. I noticed Sophie looking down at her plate while my mother spoke. Then Mom said something that felt like the final piece of her argument. She said that when families face challenges, they pull together and make sacrifices for the greater good. A few people nodded. Emily reached over and squeezed Mom's hand. That was the moment I decided it was time. I stood up slowly. The room went quiet almost immediately. I am not usually the person who interrupts speeches or makes announcements at family dinners, so everyone looked slightly confused. My mother paused mid-sentence and asked if something was wrong. I told her nothing was wrong. In fact, I said I had some good news. That caught everyone's attention. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Then I placed it gently on the table in front of Sophie. She looked at it, confused. I told her to open it. Inside were printed travel confirmations, round-trip plane tickets, hotel reservations, a small guided tour package through several cities in France, Paris, Lyon, and Nice. For a few seconds, Sophie just stared at the papers like she did not understand what she was looking at. Then her eyes widened. The room went completely silent. Emily looked from the tickets to me and asked what this meant. I explained calmly that Sophie's trip was already booked. The entire thing. Flights, hotels, activities, everything. And because of the travel schedule, it would take place during the same week as Emily's wedding. That sentence hung in the air like a dropped glass. My mother's smile slowly disappeared. Emily blinked in disbelief. Someone across the table asked if I was serious. I nodded. Very serious. I explained that Sophie had worked 3 years for that dream. I was simply finishing the last step she deserved. Sophie was still holding the tickets in her hands. Her expression caught somewhere between shock and joy. Then my mother spoke. Her voice was tight. She asked if I really planned to take Sophie out of the country during her sister's wedding week. I looked directly at her, and I said something very quietly. I said Sophie had already sacrificed enough for that wedding. Now it was time for someone else to adjust their plans. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because suddenly everyone at that table realized something. This was not just a trip. It was a line I had finally decided to draw, and my mother was not finished reacting to it yet. The room stayed silent long enough for the tension to become almost physical. My mother was the first to break it. She pushed her chair back slightly and stared at the tickets in Sophie's hands like they were something offensive sitting on her dining table. Her voice came out tight and controlled. She asked me if I understood what I was doing. According to her, the entire family had already planned around Emily's wedding week. Relatives were flying in. Hotel rooms had been booked. The ceremony schedule had been finalized. Then she asked the question she clearly expected everyone else to agree with. How could Sophie miss something so important for the family? A few people shifted in their chairs. No one immediately answered. Emily looked confused more than angry. She kept glancing between the tickets and Sophie like she was trying to understand the situation for the first time. Finally, she asked something simple. She asked if this trip had anything to do with the deposit problem from a few weeks earlier. That question made my mother stiffen. She quickly said the two things were unrelated. But I could see Sophie slowly looking up from the papers in her hands. So I told the truth. Calmly, clearly, without raising my voice. I explained that the money Sophie had saved for 3 years had been taken to cover the venue deposit for the wedding. I did not accuse anyone directly at first. I simply laid out the timeline. The visit to our house. The missing lockbox money. The sudden solution to the venue problem. By the time I finished, everyone at the table understood exactly what had happened. Emily turned slowly toward our mother. Her expression shifted from confusion to something closer to disbelief. She asked Mom if that was true. My mother tried to interrupt, saying this was not the time to discuss it. But Emily asked again, this time more firmly, and finally Mom admitted it. She repeated the same reasoning she had given me earlier. Family needed help. The wedding could not wait. The trip could happen later. But this time the explanation sounded very different in the quiet dining room. Emily looked down at the table, clearly uncomfortable. She said she never asked for that. She said she would have figured something else out if she had known. My mother tried to brush that off, saying she simply handled the situation the way any responsible parent would. That was when I spoke again. I said the trip was not meant to punish anyone. It was meant to restore something that should never have been taken in the first place. Then I added one final detail. Sophie and I would be leaving the morning before the wedding. We would spend 2 weeks in France. The entire trip was already paid and non-refundable. That sentence landed heavily. My mother looked furious now. She said I was tearing the family apart over money. But I shook my head, quietly, because the truth was simpler than that. The family had already crossed the line weeks ago. All I had done was refuse to pretend it never happened. And the person who finally spoke next made the entire room even quieter. The person who finally spoke was Sophie. Until that moment, she had stayed completely quiet, still holding the travel papers in her hands like they might disappear if she moved too fast. But now she slowly stood up from her chair. Everyone at the table turned toward her. She looked nervous, but there was something steady in her voice when she finally spoke. She said she did not want to cause problems for anyone. That part made my mother nod slightly, as if she expected Sophie to give the tickets back or apologize for the situation. But Sophie continued. She said she loved Emily and hoped the wedding would be beautiful. She said she never wanted to take attention away from something important like that. Then she paused for a moment and looked down at the papers again. When she spoke next, her voice was softer. She explained that saving for that trip had been the first big goal she had ever set for herself. Every time she babysat, walked dogs, or skipped spending money with friends, she imagined that moment when she would finally step onto a street in Paris. She said that dream helped her stay patient through a lot of things. School stress, long weekends working instead of hanging out, 3 full years of saying, maybe next time, to small things most teenagers enjoyed. Then she looked directly at my mother. Not angry, just honest. She said the part that hurt the most was not losing the money. It was learning that someone believed her dream could be taken without even asking. The room was completely silent. Even my mother did not interrupt this time. Sophie then said something none of us expected. She told Emily she still wanted to come to the wedding. She did not want her trip to hurt anyone. That surprised everyone. I asked her quietly if she was sure. She nodded. She said France had waited 3 years already. It could wait 1 more week. The only thing she wanted was for the truth to be clear, that the dream mattered, just as much as the wedding. Emily stood up then and walked around the table towards Sophie. She looked embarrassed but sincere. She said she was sorry she had not asked more questions earlier. Then she turned toward our mother. And that was the first moment my mother looked unsure of herself. Emily told her calmly that the money would be repaid immediately. Not slowly, not quietly, immediately. She said if necessary she and Mark would cut part of the reception budget to do it. My mother tried to argue, but this time no one backed her up, because now everyone understood what had actually happened. The issue had never been the wedding. It had been the assumption that one person's dream was easier to take than someone else's celebration. A week later, the money was back in Sophie's account. The wedding went forward exactly as planned. And 1 week after the ceremony, Sophie and I boarded a flight to Paris. When we stepped out onto the streets that first morning, she stood there for a long moment, just looking around at everything. Then she smiled the kind of smile I had not seen in weeks. And in that moment I realized something simple. Dreams are not just about the place you want to go. Sometimes they are about proving that what you worked for truly matters.